Shabbat Shalom, my friends. Well, the year is 2020. Can you hold on to that? I don't know about you, but I'm going to have to repeat that particular factoid over and over again before I actually believe it. 2020, 2020. Okay? I'll get there eventually. As we begin this new year, we turn to the Sedra VAYIGASH, Genesis 44:18 and following, which is the second to the last Sedra in the book of Genesis. What does that mean? Next week, we will encounter the last Sedra in Genesis and hold a Siyum. So, fair warning, it's time to prepare what you need for your own celebration. To our work. Joseph is now second only to Pharaoh in Egypt. He has been cruelly toying with his brothers who had come down to Egypt seeking relief from the famine that was afflicting Canaan. Joseph's behavior for a while looked very much like the way in which our cat treats a large moth that it had disabled. Death is not really the end game here, but torment seemed very much on the cat's agenda and on Joseph's agenda. But now this week, all of the mind games are over. Joseph finally reveals his identity to his brothers. Soon Jacob and all the rest of Joseph's family will come down to Egypt, to the land of Goshen, and settle there. The shaping of a biblical commentary is never done in the abstract. No commentator can ever be free of the world of fact and experience within which they live. Rashi's interpretations reflected the world that he knew, the world in which French and Christian cultural norms, philosophic interests, geopolitical concerns dominated the horizon. Maimonides' thought and teachings, and even his personal aspirations, were profoundly influenced by his life experience both as a refugee and then as a high-ranking member of the Sultan's court in Egypt. It is no different with comprehensive philosophic systems. Inevitably, those systems reflect not only a seeking after the purity of truth, but also a need of the philosopher to understand and describe the world as they have personally encountered it. Read Nietzsche's biography and then contemplate his core philosophic insights. That biography and those insights are constantly in conversation with each other. Nechama Leibowitz uses such an approach to understand why the 16th century commentator known as a Ramah notes that when Joseph tells Pharaoh about the presence of Joseph's brothers in Egypt, Joseph specifically refuses to ask for high honor and a physical presence in Pharaoh's court for his family. Ramah lived in the aftermath of the Jewish expulsion from Spain in 1492. He had experienced the corruption and deceit and cruelty of royal courts. He therefore feared any proximity to royal power. And then he attributed his views and his experiences to Joseph. For Ramah, Joseph did not want his family embroiled in royal politics, and it was for that reason that Joseph asked Pharaoh to permit his family to settle in Goshen, far removed from the capital. Ramah read the Torah through 16th century eyes. Fascinating. Leibowitz finds one more powerful example of this connection between biography and philosophy. The late 19th century Rabbi Naftali Tzvi Hirsch Berlin, known as the Netziv, a founder of the Volozhin Yeshiva, was an active Zionist an unusual position for a leading Orthodox thinker and teacher. Having personally experienced Russian pressure to minimalize the traditional Jewish content of his great yeshiva, he believed that the only way for his people to survive as Jews, for them to live apart, fully separate from the general community. For the Netziv, that ultimately would mean all Jews should settle in Eretz Israel. But short of that, he taught that it was an overriding obligation for Jews to adopt a full-scale commitment to live physically apart from all other peoples. Interesting. Netziv embraced a universalistic mission for the Jewish people. But at the very same time, he insisted that we could only preserve the core of our teachings by not allowing ourselves to be mixed in with everyone else. So when the Netziv read our Sedra, he taught that Joseph understood that the only way to preserve the community founded by Abraham was to live as separately as possible from all other peoples. That's the Netziv. Joseph chose Goshen, the Netziv said, because Goshen was isolated. Joseph hoped that until such time as his family could move back to Canaan, they were better off living far from any metropolitan center. Jacob, later, immediately prior to his death, asserted the primacy of Canaan. Joseph had named one of his sons Manasseh, testifying to the alienation that Joseph felt from his family and his past. Joseph wanted to forget that past because of his new life in Egypt. But then he named his other son Gershom, testifying to the fact that Joseph forever remained a stranger in a land that was never his and never could be his. So it was that Joseph, immediately prior to his own death, also reasserted his ties with Canaan. But the Israelites remained in Egypt too long. They prospered, and they began to see themselves as part of the Egyptian people. They became similar to the peoples around them, and that's when the disaster of slavery befell them. It should not be a surprise that Rabbi Shlomo Riskin, who left behind a flourishing modern Orthodox synagogue in Manhattan so as to establish a new and thriving community in Israel, fully embraced the Netziv's perspective. Riskin teaches that the only way to preserve the family of Abraham, short of their being in their own homeland, is for them to live totally separate from all other Egyptians. If one is not ready for personal aliyah, then one can at least set the boundaries around our communities very high. How are American Jews now in 2020 to read the Joseph story? This is not at all an easy question to answer. Is the Aramah correct that we only deceive ourselves when we think that the system of a government here in America can be trusted to protect us from the poisonous hatred of Jews that still exists in the very foundations of Western society? Or is the Netziv correct that the greatest threat to the Jewish future is not to be found in overt oppression, but rather in the seductiveness of general culture, a seductiveness that can render us invisible without a collective future, without a sense of a specific purpose and mission. The late, brilliant Gertrude Himmelfarb of blessed memory was opposed to the notion that what occurred in the past necessarily prefigures that which awaits us in the future. Does the brutal attack on guests gathered to celebrate Hanukkah in a rabbi's house in Monsey tell us that not even physical separation, not even self-ghettoization can shelter us from hatred? What are we learning? What are we learning from events in our own day, this very day, that will shape how we view and understand and choose to live in our world? Joseph's request for his family to be allowed to live in Goshen is like a standalone ink blot, not just a part of a grand narrative. How will we in 2020 read that ink blot? How will we choose to apply Joseph's act in light of the world in which we and our children and our grandchildren now live? My friends, I can't offer a prepackaged answer. So let's take some time this Shabbat to think through our own personal responses. Maybe even talk those responses over with others. It could be very interesting. It will be very important. Shabbat Shalom.